Hello everybody, Nox here, and today I'm bringing you a starter guide to the Evade Stormfeather Spiritborn. The version you're seeing in the background is intentionally nerfed to snapshot how it feels to play at the beginning of Torment 4. Gear is not perfect, none of the legendary aspects have max rolls, all gear is only 8 out of 12 tempering, glyphs are only level 60, and Paragon is capped at 150. And finally, I removed a damage aspect from the build to reduce its damage even further. I wanted to give a showcase of something that was achievable with a little bit of effort for an average player. There will be several Pit 65 runs, as well as some Torment 4 bossing footage as I explain. Before we begin, big shout out and thank you to all the supporters on Twitch and Patreon who keep the channel going. More how you can support at the end. For now, let's begin. Shout out to Insane Bob and Woody Joe, who I believe were the first to put this build together. This is just my version of it. The main interaction on how the build works, we are using the Eagle Spirit Hall, which says, when you cast an Eagle skill, grants 4 seconds of the Storm Feather's movement speed bonus. And when you evade, fling up to 8 Storm Feathers for every remaining second, each dealing lightning damage and making targets vulnerable for 5 seconds. These feathers are what do all of our damage in the build, and they're the only thing that will be scaling. Then we have our basic skill Thunderspike, which on the third attack reduces our evade cooldown by 5 seconds. Evade by default has a 5-second cooldown. When we talent into Accelerated Thunderspike, it causes our evade to cast Thunderspike and make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. Then we have the unique Quarterstaff Sepazontak, which has the effect basic skills deal increased damage and always use our third attack. These 3 things in combination mean we press evade casts Thunderspike and shoots out Storm Feathers. Since it's the third cast, Thunderspike reduce our evade cooldown, rinse, and repeat. That's how the entire build functions. The only 2 things you need to get started are the unique Sepazontak and at least 2 evade charges. The evade charge is easy because we get it on the skill tree through the acceleration passive. The weapon drops from Duriel or Indariel, and the rolls on the weapon besides dexterity do not matter. Literally any staff will do. Ancestral is better because higher weapon damage, but don't pay hundreds of millions of gold for a triple, quad, or quad greater affect staff unless you just want the style points. Once you have those 2 things, you're good to go, and you'll likely be finding up to Torment 2 pretty comfortably, but there are a couple more uniques the build wants long term. First off, Loyalty's Mantle. We only care about the damage reduction roll, and the unique line, when your Spirit Hall choices match, their bonuses are 100% more potent. This doubles the baseline damage of your Storm Feathers, and this item drops most commonly from Brigor. Again, don't overspend on this helmet. Then we have Rakanoth's Wake. These are worn for the resistance rolls and cooldown reduction only. The most important role here is the resistance. I should mention that you should also look at Yen's Blessing. They tend to be cheaper, and they also have the all resist that we're looking for, so if you're just trying to cap res, those are a good starter piece. On to the legendary aspects. Defensives first. We have aspect of layered wards, which is great. We have a lot of block chance in this build. We're using a quarterstaff, so that gives us quite a bit, and so it synergizes well. We also use the aspect of might for 20% damage reduction when we basic attack, which is constantly. Damaging aspects next. We have aspects of redirected force on the amulet, which increases our critical strike damage based upon our block chance. We have a lot of block chance. This is why. The offensive aspect I left out of the video is Edge Masters, which increases our damage by 25% when we have maximum resources, which is 100% of the time. I should note that other guides recommend using Aspect of Elements, which is a 35% damage buff, but it's only up half the time versus the 25% 100% of the time. Again, none of the footage had either to showcase. I'm just pointing it out. You could use Aspect of Elements if you had a crazy good roll on that one and a terrible Edge Masters. Just tossing it out there. The next is the Conceited aspect, which increases our damage when we have a barrier, which is always. Finally, we have the aspect of Unyielding Hits, which increases our weapon damage by a percentage of our armor when we use a Gorilla skill. For this reason, we want to stack as much armor as possible, and it will be reflected in the temper choices that I will discuss later. The Gorilla skill procs automatically from our rune combinations, that I'll discuss right now. The rune combinations we use are Moni and Gar, which gives us crit whenever we cast a skill after moving, which is all the time. Then we have Kem and Tizak. This is a free cast of the Gorilla skill Concussive Stomp when we evade 4 times. We're constantly evading, so we're constantly getting that cast. This makes it so our aspect of unyielding hits us up 100% of the time. This is why we want as much armor as possible. We want to put one of those rune combinations into our staff so we have more slots to put emeralds in our armor for dexterity. For our jewelry sockets, we want to use diamonds if we need to cap resistances, but skulls otherwise, because again, more armor is more weapon damage from that final aspect. Quickly jumping into game here to go over skills and passives worth noting. A lot of people asked why we put 4 points into Thunder Spike because we are not scaling that damage at all. This is simply because nothing here and nothing here benefits us at all. So we're tossing 4 points into Thunder Spike into accelerating. This is how the build functions. None of these passives matter. Coming over here, I do take Soar into the Measured Soar. This just gives us Unstoppable. Apex for more vulnerable damage, diminishing for damage reduction against vulnerable enemies. Enemies are always vulnerable with us. I do take max points into Focal Point because we have a lot of block chance, so the additional block damage reduction is nice. 3 points into Mirage because we gain a ton of dodge chance during evade. We're constantly evading. It's hard to see, and this is probably going to be very difficult to watch. But when I'm evading constantly, you'll see our dodge chance here. When I'm evading, it's going to like 87% dodge chance while I'm zipping around. Moving on, we do take Ravager, and this is the passive doesn't really do anything for us because attack speed doesn't matter. We're just evading, and that overrides attack speed, but the active is an excellent cooldown. It just allows us to strike additional times, and we take Replenishing Ravager where it passively stockpiles any healing you receive up to 40 stacks, and then while active, Ravager spends stacks to strike elite enemies up to 4 additional times. This is just some extra damage. Jumping down over here, we take Armored Hide. This is mostly for the passive effect, but we do press it from time to time. Like if we need a defensive cooldown. We also take Perseverance. This is additional damage reduction per stack of Resolve. Armored Hide gives us that Resolve passively. We do spec into Concussive Stomp, even though it's being cast automatically. This will hit enemies as we're rolling through them. It'll just constantly be casting the Concussive Stomp around us. And it will give us a barrier, which is good for our conceited aspect, and it's also good for survivability. I do take 5 points into counterattack. This is so we can get the 15% passive dodge chance. This is the only reason why we have counterattack here. You can also press it as a defensive cooldown. Also have a damage buff from it. Counterattack passively increases our critical strike damage for every close enemy up to 30%. We take 1 point into Patient Guard. This is just so we can get the additional block chance. We do not benefit from the second effect at all. Auspicious is amazing. It is another source of our barrier. We get 6% of our maximum life every second, up to 60%. This combined with our Concussive Stomp means that we have 100% of our health as barrier, and we'll get into that, why that's good for our Paragon later. We take Resilient so we can get extra maximum life. We're constantly casting a Gorilla skill, so we just did 20% extra life is nice. We take 3 points into Brilliance. This is just movement speed, gives us a little bit more damage, which is nice. Our acceleration passive here is just to give us the additional evade charge. We take 3 points into Potent. This works in interaction with Ravager. So Ravager counts as a Jaguar skill while we're hitting them, even though it's the extra damage from it. And so this is 30% extra damage from this. This is also the passive we're probably going to look for on our amulet if you get lucky enough to find one. And then questions about the ultimate here. I take 5 points into the Devourer, and that is simply so we can get this resolution here, which casting an ultimate skill gives 15% increased damage to elites for 3 seconds. Double this bonus if you're only finding one enemy, so 30% damage on bosses, which is nice. Helps burst things down. And then Supremacy here. Any enemies you kill while an ultimate is active grants a stack. Increases your damage by 3% up to 30%. And when an ultimate skill ends, you gain 5 stacks, but lose 1 stack every second. So if I had better gear on this character, and you took the Devourer cooldown here and I masterworked and crit that, I could get 100% uptime on my Devourer, which means I would have 100% uptime on this buff, and it would scale up to 30% on the front end, and then an additional 30% on the back end from the extra stacks the Ravager is giving you. So this could be a significant amount of damage if you have more Devourer cooldown, which is why we like Rakanoths for the cooldown reduction, and it's why we like the Devourer cooldown on our Tempers. Finally, for our key passive, we are doing Vital Strikes. This is 45% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. We have 3 things in the build that make enemies vulnerable. It is evading through them, it is hitting them with Thunder Spike here, and it is our Storm Feathers themselves that are making enemies vulnerable. So enemies are vulnerable all the time. After making an enemy vulnerable, your next directed damage to them will heal you, generate some vigor, and remove the vulnerable effect. But this doesn't matter. We will constantly have vulnerable up because the next hit will apply it. So we have that up 100% of the time. Moving on to the Paragon really quick. The reason why my Paragon board looks different from maybe some of the other guides is simply an aesthetic choice. I prefer to go from left to right, and I prefer to have them sort of in a line versus branching out. I think it's easier to follow along with a Paragon tree if you have it this way. This is why mine is like that. For our first board here, I put Spirit, just because it's really easy to get the dexterity we need just traveling up. For the next board, we have Convergence with Jagged Plume. Convergence is dealing bonus damage equal to 20% of our 2 highest bonuses to damage types. That's why we take a lot of non-physical damage on the Paragon tree. Jagged Plume is giving us additional Storm Feather potency, which is just more damage overall. Spirit is extra critical strike damage. Moving over to the third board, we have Vicious Shield. You do 1% increased damage for each 3% of maximum life you have as barrier. So this, we want as much barrier as possible. That's why we take points in Auspicious. That's why we have our Concussive Stomp giving us barrier as well. For the glyph we're using Talon, which is giving us additional eagle damage, and eagle skills deal increased critical strike damage. Moving on to the fourth board, we have Drive, which after moving 10 meters, you deal 3% increased damage for 10 seconds, stacking up 10 times. We're constantly moving. This is constantly up. And we take Fulminate, which is damage to healthy and injured enemies, and increased lightning damage. And for our fifth and final board, we have the Sapping board. When you cast 3 Gorilla, Jaguar, or Eagle skills with the same spirit in a row, restore 15% of your vigor and deal 30% increased damage for 5 seconds. And you might be thinking to yourself, wait, don't we cast Gorilla skills in between our evades? So aren't we losing this bonus? No. If you go over to the Spirit Hall, all skills are now Eagle skills, so that includes the automatic proc of Concussive Stomp. That's an Eagle skill as well. And for the last glyph, we use Canny, which is increased non-physical damage and additive increased non-physical damage. You'll see in all the footage, I had 72 points extra. I think this puts me at Paragon 153 or something like that. The first several Paragons are really, really quick to get to. It doesn't really slow down until Paragon 200 anyway. So I think that will be obtainable with time. If for some reason you were light on points, you could drop some resistance here. You could drop one of the legendary nodes, I suppose, if you wanted to. But I would just follow along with this and shoot for filling out one board, then the next, then the next, then the next. Sapping will be the last one, and that's okay. Once you get to it, you'll feel that 30% damage bonus, and it will feel fine. And here at the end, quickly going over the gear. I just wanted to reiterate again, Loyalty's Mantle and Sepizontac. People are overpaying for these because they think greater affixes are cool, I guess. You do not need insane affixes on either of these to make them good. You are getting them for their unique effect, and the unique effect cannot roll any better. The basic skills always use the third attack as the only thing we care about on this staff. If you wanted to get a greater affix dexterity, that's good. Same thing with Loyalty's Mantle. The only thing we care about is when your Spirit Hold choices match, their bonuses are increased by 100%, or they're 100% more potent. The only other thing we care about here is the damage reduction. You could care about all stats if you wanted. So if you wanted to get a double greater affix with those two things, that'd be fine. And then for Rakanoths, you do want a greater affix on the resistances. They are pretty expensive. Again, like I said, look at Yen's Blessing if you're struggling to cap resistances. If you have Ethereal's Might, you could use that in place of one of these defensive aspects, totally fine, and it would completely remove your need for Rakanoths, and you could use boots with more dexterity to get more damage or some other passive that you think would be beneficial. For the chest piece, I did Temper on Auspicious. That's for extra barrier and some lucky chance to freeze. I'm looking at Dex, Max Life, and Armor on as many pieces as I can get it. For the offensive tempers, we want as much Storm Feather potency as possible. So you'll see I have that on my gloves and on my rings. On my amulet, unfortunately, I was not able to get that. I got vulnerable damage instead, but that percentage armor roll is good to temper on as well. And that's pretty much a snapshot of the gear as it stands right now. I will quickly mouse over what I'm currently using just so everyone can see what's going on. And that was what was in the footage. And with that, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you're interested in supporting the channel, please go ahead and drop a follow or a sub on Twitch or on my Patreon. Thank you very much for watching. And thank you to those that are supporting so far. And I will see you guys next time.